Greetings from the North Carolina chapter of the Wildlife Society. My name is Bob Hazel, North Carolina chapter, and we're today for an interview, one of a series of interviews I'm called Celebrating Our Wildlife Conservation Heritage. Now, this is a program started a couple of years ago by the Wildlife Society for documenting the history and experiences of the pioneers in the field of wildlife conservation. So that's what we're doing today, and the best way to do that is to hear it firsthand from the persons who did the work and experienced it. And today we're interviewing one of those people. It's Mr. Ron Bailey. Ron is a retired agent with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He has had a long and distinguished career, much of it in North Carolina, and played an important part in the development of the outstanding program in North Carolina. And during this interview, Ron will share with us his experiences and some of the highlights and accomplishments of his career. So Ron, I suggest that we begin by having you give us some of your personal background information, like family history, date and place of birth, and so forth. Introduce your family, how you got into the wildlife profession. And you take it from there and tell us the story like you want to tell it.
Okay, Bob. I guess it's safe to say that this all began for me back in 1947. I was born and raised in rural central Ohio, the beginning of the breadbasket of the West or the Midwest, raised in a farm community, and hunting and fishing and trapping and church on Sunday was pretty much a way of life. I'd say hunting and trapping and fishing was a part of our culture. At age 12, a young friend of mine by the name of Jimmy Roush and I decided we would trap that year, and we further decided that we would trap about 2 weeks before the season come in to kind of get the jump on our peers. And so we proceeded to do this near a little community by the name of Ostrander, Ohio, just north of Columbus, on a little creek called Blues Creek. I remember we had 8 traps between us, and we had just finished setting the 8th trap, which is a very complicated mink set. And I happened to glance up the hill, and I saw this tall, slender gentleman coming down the hill in the most striking green uniform I had ever seen. And it will suffice to say he was a game warden, and his name was Ollie Niemeyer. And he apprehended both of us. But Ollie was a first-class gentleman. We were juveniles, of course. And I'll never forget there was a big rock that sat there in the edge of the creek, and our game warden friend set us both up on the big rock. And that day in early November 1947, I got my first lesson in wildlife management. Ollie had the ability to explain in language that 2 12-year-old kids could understand, both the biological and the sociological aspects to our game laws in Ohio and how they were enacted. And then he took us down the creek, and we pulled all of our traps. And he took our names and addresses, and then he escorted us up to his automobile and opened his trunk. And how vividly I remember, the trunk was completely level with steel leg-hole traps with a couple of wet coons still in them and a couple of muskrats. But he went on to explain that Ollie was not our game protector in Delaware County. He was from Marion County. He went on to explain that Guy Dennis, who was the game protector in Delaware County, would be in contact with our parents, and he took our traps along with all the other ones. And I'll never forget, he wrote filled out a big tag that said evidence on it, and threw the traps in the trunk of the car and went on with his patrol. Well, I come away from that experience, shall we say, very profoundly influenced. And Jimmy and I never trapped again. We resolved that we would try it again when the season came back in, but we actually never got that done. Mr. Dennis never did come and call on either of the families. I was scared to death thinking that he would, but I know I went home and ultimately told my parents that's what I would someday do for a living. And my parents had a very favorable reaction. Dad said, well, it's a good way to get shot. And Mother urged me to go ahead and to pursue my dreams and hope that I would follow what the good Lord led me to do. So as time went on, I remember in high school I saw a notice on the bulletin board outside the principal's office. It was in my senior year. And it offered night classes at Columbus Central High School in Columbus to all students in Central Ohio. And if you were in so many credits for graduation, you could take advantage of this program. And of course, it was designed to give you the opportunity to take a full-time job and get money for college. And it looked pretty good to me. And I remember it wasn't publicized at all because the school was funded on a per-student basis, and the various schools didn't want to lose students. But the State Board of Education had ordered that these notices be put up and this program be promoted. So anyway, I wound up going to Columbus Central in my semester year, and I took a full-time job on a retail dry cleaning route. I remember the name of the company was Ohio Curtis Cleaners. And my father had been in the dry cleaning business for a few years, and there wasn't too much I didn't know about that business, so I took that job. And for a kid my age, the pay was very good, but my route consisted of the living quarters at the Ohio State University campus, student quarters. All Grandview Heights, Dublin, Upper Arlington, all the suburbs, North Columbus. And one of my customers happened to be a gentleman named Don Warren, who worked for U.S. Geological Survey. And of course I still had this dream and ambition to become a game protector, but I had intended to go to Ohio State. That never happened. I delivered Don's dry cleaning one evening, and we struck up a conversation. And I told him what I wanted to do, and he said, well, you need to go see Mr. Chick Marion. He is the director of the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, and of course that meant absolutely nothing to me, but he said, Chick is a very good friend of mine. And he said, he can certainly give you some advice on the direction you need to go and what you need to do to become a game warden. And so there I was, a 18, almost 19-year-old kid, and I found myself the next morning knocking on Chick Marion's door in downtown Columbus, about 9 o'clock, and very nice receptionist who brought me through the door and asked me what I wanted or what she could do for me. I said, well, I want to see Mr. Chick Marion, and she said, well, what do you want? I said, well, I want to be a game warden. Couldn't have made it much plainer. She got him on the intercom, I'll never forget, and he found my direct approach kind of humorous. He said, send the young man in. I met one of the nicest gentlemen I've ever met. And he talked to me a little bit, and he said, well, he said, you know, there's hundreds of young men in the state of Ohio that would like to be game protectors. And I said, no, I didn't know that, but I can sure understand why. And he wanted to know what had led me and why I had such a desire, and I told him the story of getting caught by Officer Niemeyer when I was about 12 years old. It happened that Chick knew Officer Niemeyer. He said, well, I'll never forget, he said, you got caught by the old master himself, didn't you? And I said, well, I guess I did. So he picked up the phone. We had a little more conversation there. And he told me about the Wildlife Officers Training School, and I'd have to be 21 before I could be considered for it. And he picked up the phone and called over to 15 Dublin Road to the Ohio Division of Wildlife. Well, first I didn't realize the Chick was over the Division of Wildlife, the Division of Forestry, the Division of Parks, and 4 other agencies, and answered only to the governor. So here was this dumb kid not knowing the important man that he was talking to, but he called Dr. Charles Danball, who was chief of the Division of Wildlife, and said, I've got a young man here that's got some very high aspirations, and I'm going to send him over and see what you can do for him. And I'll never forget, he picked up a lead pencil after he concluded his phone conversation with Dr. Danball, and he pointed that lead pencil at me, and he said, are you willing to start at the bottom? He said, I mean at the very bottom. I said, oh, yes, sir. And he said, well, that's the way it's going to be. He said, if you get hired at all, he said, I'm going to send you over to the Division of Wildlife, and you're going to speak to the chief over there. He's waiting to see you. He asked me if I knew how to get to 1500 Dublin Road, and I said, yes, sir, I drive by it every day on my dry cleaning route. So over there I went and met with Dr. Danball, who was very, very polite, but also very abrupt. And he took me down to meet a gentleman named John Pelton, who was head of the fisheries section. And I'll never forget, John offered me a job at Lake St. Mary's at Fish Hatchery at 96 cents an hour for 90 days. And but he said, before you make up your mind, he said, let's go down and talk to Doc Martin down in the game management section. So he took me down, and Doc, we never did know his first name, but he was very abrupt and almost didn't seem to want to take any time with me at all, but he very quickly told me, he said, you're report for work tomorrow if you want the job at the old Tansy Wildlife Research Station at Delaware Dam, 3 miles from my home. And the deal was the same thing, 96 cents an hour for 90 days. And I walked out of there. I started to leave, and he said, well, there's one more stop you've got to make. He said, you need to talk to Les Bailey in law enforcement. So I was sent down to the law enforcement office and met Mr. Les Bailey, who was a very colorful character. We wound up talking. I'll never forget, he told me all the Baileys in Ohio that had thick hair were Republicans, and all that were bald-headed were Democrats. And I said, well, that makes you a Democrat and me a Republican. And he went on to explain the particulars of the training school and how long I'd have to wait. And he said, I won't be around to see if you make it or not, but he said, good luck. He said, they're putting me out to pasture in about 6 months. So I left there, and the next morning I reported for work at the Delaware Wildlife Research Station, and the good Lord could not possibly have placed me in a better place for training, nurturing, the whole 9 yards. Stationed there, headquarters there, was this gentleman over here, Dr. Bill Edwards, who was the upland game biologist for the state, former Ohio State football star, played under Woody Hayes. And he became my very closest friend, mentor, and educator. Also stationed there was the state waterfowl biologist, Delmar Hanley, and federal aid coordinator. The big game, forest game biologist, Frank Haller, was stationed there. It was his headquarters. And then another, more or less biologist at large was Carl Mosley, who later went on to become chief of the Division of Wildlife. But during my time there, especially with Bill here, I got to travel all over Ohio. I got to work on all manner of game and habitat surveys. These are my textbooks that he put me through. He started me with Aldo Leopold, and who of course started the whole thing in modern wildlife management in 1933. And my next textbook was Edward Graham. And Mr. Graham was a soil scientist with the Soil Conservation Service, and wrote what I regard today as the best book on wildlife management, in that he did an excellent job of tying wildlife management in with soil conservation and water conservation. He kind of drove that home better than the other authors. And my next book was Ira Gabrielson, Wildlife Management, which was in 1951. And I've still got all these books. The next one is, of course, Dirkwood Allen and Our Wildlife Legacy. And this one I devoured. I went through it 3 times. As a matter of fact, this is the 2nd edition. But all of this, thanks to this gentleman, and he went on to leave Ohio and go with the Illinois Natural History Survey, where he ultimately got his doctorate in Illinois and passed away last June. I believe it was June, Mom, or June a year ago. I know he wore heavy on my mind just about 6 months before he passed, and I called him. And he wanted to know where I'd been and what I'd done. And he said, "My Lord, Ron," he said, you've done everything you set out to do. But he was a great man, and I'll never forget him. I went to Delaware there in 1953 at the research station. And one day Bill called me into his office, and he said, "If I didn't think you were ready for this," he said, "I wouldn't be telling you about it." But he said, "The area manager's job is open at the Spring Valley. It's coming open. It's the Spring Valley Wildlife Management Area down in District 6. And he said, Dale Whitesell is the district game management supervisor down there, and I spoke to him about you." He said, "I guess I should ask you, do you want the job?" And I said, "Oh, Lord, yes." So shortly I was out on the management area working. I should add that in addition to the research station at Delaware, there was an 8,000-acre public hunting area with a 3,000-acre lake and dam constructed by the Corps of Engineers. So I also got to work on that wildlife management area with all their staff, who was separate, of course, from the research people. And but in a few days, I was called over to the office, and I met Dale Whitesell, who I guess was one of the most dynamic personalities I ever met. Dale went on to become chief of the Division of Wildlife and retired as executive director of Ducks Unlimited. But that was my first promotion. I should say second. I went from 90 days at 96 cents an hour as a laborer 1 to a laborer 2 with a permanent job at $1.26 an hour. But as I recall, when I went to Spring Valley, this would have been about, 56, Mom?
Yes.
I went to Spring Valley as the area manager. My salary was around $250 a month. I was allowed 50 chickens, 2 hogs, and 1 beef that I could raise at state expense, plus all the garden space I could plant. And of course, when I went to Spring Valley in Ohio, everybody from my job classification then went to game production foreman. And everybody that held the position of game or fishery production foreman on up was a commissioned wildlife officer. You were commissioned, and they pinned a badge on you, and you got everything except the dress uniform. They didn't. That was issued only to the full-time county game protectors and the wildlife patrolmen. But at age 21, I was a commissioned game protector for the state of Ohio, and I went to Spring Valley, which is down near Xenia, Ohio, southeast part of the state. It was very small but very heavily utilized public hunting and fishing area. And its proximity to Dayton, Ohio, contributed to the heavy hunting and fishing pressure that it had. It only had about 150 acres of lake and marsh, and when I went there, only about 1,000 acres of land. And today, I don't think it's grown much bigger than that, but the area was very heavily utilized, and I got to see firsthand what public land means to the public. I don't think I ever experienced or went anyplace else in my career where that was driven home anymore, the importance of wildlife lands and the desperate need for it. That area was utilized by everybody from mushroom hunters to coon hunters and trappers and fishermen, and it was just a fabulous experience. But as far as my law enforcement duties was concerned, I was assigned a training officer, a wildlife patrolman named Vern Bear. Big guy, ex-underwater World War II UDT man. That was the frog man. And he was a big, rough individual and certainly no man to fool with. And I don't guess I could have got a better man to train me in law enforcement, because I got a call from the Xenia office one day and said, "You're to meet with Patrolman Bear tomorrow morning," which was on Saturday. "He'll be at your house before daylight, and you're going to check fishing license with him, fisherman, over in Clinton County." So Bear came in, and I met him for the first time, and we went to Cowan's Lake in Clinton County outside of Wilmington. And I'll never forget, we pulled up in an inlet off the lake, and there was 6 black folks down there fishing, having the time of their lives. They really enjoyed the outdoors, all of them that I ever met. And I recall that the one lady there would probably weigh about 300 pounds, and she was sitting on a wash tub with a board over it and some bricks under it to heighten it, and she's catching a little old brim and catfish and dropping them down in about 10 inches of water in that tub. And Vern started in right then. He said, "Now, just because you see people down there doesn't mean they're fishing. You have to sit and watch." And he said, you need to see them handle a pole, and better still, you need to see them catch a fish. In other words, establish in your mind and under the law that they're fishing, and then you go check them. And of course, I hung on to every word. And we observed the fishermen through binoculars for a while, and he said, "Are you satisfied?" And I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "All right, let's go check them." Well, I very promptly got out of his patrol car and slammed the door and got my first butt chewing. I walked around in front of that car, and there stood Bear with his hands on his hips. And I don't guess I better say what all he said to me. I never slammed the door again. But anyway, we went down the bank, and of course he sent me to the black lady. He went on down the bank there to check the remainder of the fishermen. I'll never forget, I walked up to her, and I said, a few comments on the weather, and I said, "May I see your fishing license?" And I could see Vern out of the corner of my eye shaking his head again. I knew I'd done something else wrong. But anyway, she said, what if I don't have one? And Vern had explained to me before we got there that we were going to check a lot of fishermen from Cincinnati. If we cited them into court, they wouldn't come, and we would probably be taking them into Wilmington to post bond. He said, "It's going to cut into our patrol time." He said, "That's what we have to do," because he said, "You don't want to go to Cincinnati serving warrants." He said, "That is a nightmare." So I went into this long talk about if she didn't have a license, I was going to have to take her to Wilmington, and she was going to have to post a bond. And she said, "What if I don't want to go?" And now I'm in trouble. I can't move this 300-pound woman, and we're not going to handcuff her on a misdemeanor. I knew that, so directly I could see Vern walking my way, and he walked up and put his arm around the lady and said, "Maybelle, show this boy your fishing license." It was a setup. Yeah. That was it was a training exercise. All the rest of those folks down there broke up laughing, and we left, and she had her license in her tackle box. I'll never forget, she said, the young man said, "All you got to do is do what Mr. Bear here says, and you'll be all right." So we left there, and of course, I worked for a couple of years under Vern. We made a lot of cases. I learned how to do search warrants, and testify in court, and after the fact investigating. And he was a great, great training officer. I'll tell one other war story with Daddy Bear. And before he'd become a patrolman, he was a Butler County game protector. And he wanted to take me down on the Great Miami River and show me. He said, "There's always action down there." And he said, "I just want to show you some old patrol area." So I met him on a Saturday morning, and down to Great Miami we went. In the springtime, and the spring migration, waterfowl was on, spring waterfowl migration. And I'll never forget the vast numbers of ducks and geese and everything we saw everywhere. We got clear down into check fishermen all the way down, and we got down into Butler County. And we found this long stretch of river with, oddly enough, very few fishermen on it. A long pool. And there's about 7 or 8 fishermen down there, and we went down and checked them. And there's a road that ran parallel with the river, flood control levee behind that. And I'll never forget, I looked up and saw this big black Lincoln with black windows and everything coming down that gravel road, and it stopped. And I saw the muzzle of a rifle come out the window. There's a little group of shoveler ducks over on the other side of the river, busy dabbling and having a good time. And I heard the crack of a rifle, and one of those shovelers just disintegrated right in front of 2 game wardens. And I remember Bear said, "My Lord, it's those mafia guys again." And I never heard anything like this before. And he headed for them. So I backed him up way back. He got down there, and this window came down, and this, "Hi, Vern, how you doing?" in this raspy voice. "Well, just fine, fellas, and we got a little problem." "Well, what is it, Vern?" He said, "Well, you just violated the law again." He'd arrested the 2 in the back seat before, and they were mafia figures out of Cincinnati. And nicest gentleman you ever want to meet. And he went ahead and explained the federal law had been violated. And he said, "I'm going to have that rifle, beautiful 220 Swift." And he took the rifle and explained the federal charges. And this gentleman, the gunner in the back seat, one of those explained again. And he said, "Well, Vern, can't we just slip down here to the squire and take care of this like we did the last time?" And Vern said, "Well, we sure can." So they followed us, and we went down to Squire Bolzer, was the justice of peace there in a nearby community. We got ready to go in the courtroom, and Vern says, "Well, gentlemen, you better leave your hardware outdoors." I said, "The only guns that go in are mine and the other officers and your rifle." And the 4 gentlemen rolled out of that big Lincoln and opened the trunk door and took their coats off and started taking 45 automatics off in shoulder holsters and putting them in the trunk of that car. We went in, Vern charged the gunner with taking closed season, charged the driver with aiding and abetting. And Squire Bolzer hit the gunner $200 and the aider $100. But on at Vern's request, the gun was given back to him, and the case was closed. And so when we got away from there, I said, "I got to have some explanations on this one." He said, "Well, they were mafia figures out of Cincinnati." He said, "All the time I was in Butler County," he said, "I probably arrested a dozen of them, never once had trouble with them." He said, "Those boys are not about to give a game warden trouble and get any publicity over a misdemeanor. They just want to get it settled."
Keep it quiet.
We left there and got all the way back up into Montgomery County, and we pulled up to this one bridge. We made one case, fishing without a license, on the way up. And actually, we only made about 7 cases the whole day, not including the mafia. But we got up there and we pulled up to a bridge, and there was a lady down there with a group of children. They all had life jackets on the river. And fishermen on below them, and we glassed the fishermen below them. And Vern says, I have to get around that woman down there. He said, "I don't want to." He said, "What we're going to do here," he said, "we're going to walk down the road and we're going to put a circle in behind her and check our fishermen." He handed me the keys to the car. He said, "Then I'm going to come out in that field and you pick me up in the car and we'll get out of here." So I thought that was kind of strange. And so we proceeded to cut the big circle around the lady and the kiddies. When the lady saw him down there, she forgets, she says, "All kiddies, Daddy Bear is here." And Vern motioned me on. Well, she come up and got him by the arm, had him down there at the creek. I went on down and checked the other fishermen. The whole time I'm looking up the creek, and walked up the first time, and Vern had all those little kids sitting down in a circle, and obviously talking to them. And I went back up to where he was at there with the children, and the lady said, "Well, kiddies, Daddy Bear has to leave now." And all the kids were jumping up. Well, then they just mobbed him. They were hanging on his gun belt, climbing on his shoulders. Everything else, we got back up to the car, and I said, "All right, let's hear it, Daddy Bear." I said, "What was that all about?" I said, "I think the lady kind of likes you." And he said, "I don't want to hear any more." He said, "I ran into her some years ago, and she says she babysits children. Never saw her down here on a Saturday before. But she says she looks on me like some kind of a Smokey Bear or something. And I have to tell those kids a story." And I said, "Well, what do you tell them?" He said, "Well, you know, the golden rule and that kind of stuff." He said, "What, are you going to turn a kid down?" But that pretty well typified Vern. An awful rough exterior with the heart as big as all outdoors.
Right.
But anyway, I concluded my training under Vern and started making cases on my own then at Spring Valley, and made one of the biggest cases I ever made when I was 21 years old. And that involved, I don't know, just everywhere I went that night, I run into something, from coon hunting out of season to about 9 o'clock. Well, early today I got a fellow with a couple of raptors in his hunting coat. Squirrel season was in, and 3 hunting without a season. And 2:30 in the morning, I got 2 Eastern Kentucky gentlemen shooting rabbits and pheasants in the headlights of the Buick in an old stubble field. I'll never forget, I got in bed that morning about daylight, but I sure cut my teeth on that case. Matter of fact, I wrote about it. I called it a busy night on Anderson's Fork. But shortly after that, Union County, which is right next to my home county, game protector's position came open. And I was called by Eldon Sturgeon, law enforcement supervisor in Xenia, asked if I wanted that county. He says, "You're making more cases than most of our full-time game protectors." And I said, "Yes, I'd love to have that county." I said, "When's the next training school?" He says, "You're not going to a training school. You don't need to." And I think I recall one other gentleman that did not go through a training school to get a game protector's commission and assigned to a county. But in any event, I left Spring Valley after being there about 4 years, and went into Union County as county game protector. And what year was that, Mom? About
1960.
Anyway, that was another experience. I followed an awful good officer in that county who had been promoted to wildlife patrolman named Dick Francis, who later became chief of the Division of Wildlife. But following Dick Francis, he was a super game warden, kept a clean county. He was a household word all over the county, some good, some bad. But I made a lot of good cases there, met a lot of nice people, got a lot of good experience. And then my next assignment, or next promotion, was to wildlife patrolman, which was an investigator's type job. And I worked 4 counties in northwestern Ohio. And it was there that I met this gentleman.
Gentleman.
Huh?
Oh, you mean Mel? I thought he meant me.
That was absolutely the best game warden I ever worked with in my life. And I should say that I had a marriage before I married her. And I was single at the time when I went to Williams County. And he introduced me to this lady, and she was a court clerk, and I met her over in the illegal deer case. And we've been together ever since, haven't we?
40 years.
She's followed me all over the country. But anyway, I worked up there and had a...
Uh-oh, phone's ringing.
We made a lot of good cases. And I know we had one after the fact case we worked that involved...
Take a break. Okay.
11 individuals out of the state of Camden, Michigan, and they were coming to Ohio.
Hi, Bill.
and
Uh-huh, sure am.
poaching deer on two major land tracts there right on the state line. And this group of individuals, oddly enough, in that particular region where Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan all came together, the best deer habitat was in Ohio. There was two major land holdings up there, one owned by the Boy Scouts of America, and the other one known as the Broadbeck Estate, right on the Michigan and Indiana state line. And it was just an absolute pristine wilderness area with a lot of good agriculture around it. The area was very well watered with ponds and streams and parts of the St. Joe River, and it's just where all the deer was at. But this group was coming down and was poaching deer, and to make a long story short, we worked, I think, most of 1965 and 66 on that case, and we went right to the bottom of the barrel. We got them all, and we got them all on after the fact investigating. We never caught one person in the act. And we would get one to sign a confession and write pink on the next one. And of course, we had an awful good court. Just to put it bluntly, we had a hanging judge, her boss. And let's say we didn't have any trouble getting convictions. But we wound up that deer poaching ring, and during that investigation, the leader of that ring was a farm implement dealer at Camden, Michigan. And the first time we attempted, of course, we carried federal U.S. Deputy Game Warden commissions, which allowed us to go into the adjoining states under the auspices of the Lacey Act, which prohibits the interstate transportation and movement of illegal wildlife. But this individual, just the same as told us to go you know where. And we made a mistake by trying to start with him, and we didn't know if we'd blowed the whole thing or not. But then we fell back and regrouped, you might say, and started using some investigative techniques that we've been trained to do, and went after him again, and we wound up rounding up all of them. But at the very tail end of that, this ringleader, who ultimately signed a confession and came to Ohio and pled guilty, I remember he paid $2,300 in fines. And he let two more names slip out that heretofore we didn't have. And I started questioning him about these two names, letting on that we already had the names, that we just hadn't got to them yet, but that was a lie. We never heard of them before. And he told us that he'd only been out with them on one occasion when he first started doing this illegal activity. He knew that they had not killed a deer in his presence, or he would have remembered that, but he simply couldn't remember enough about those hunts to give me enough that I could intelligently go question him, was what I was after. And I read a little piece in the Montpelier paper about a hypnotist in Montpelier, who was also a Methodist minister, who had used hypnosis on the local football team. And the coach claimed that it had substantially improved the performance of that football team. Well, in addition to that, I had read a book a couple of years earlier called The Bridie Murphy Story about regressive hypnosis. And in this book, this hypnotist not only regressed her back in time, he regressed her back to a former life. But I think everybody remembers that book, and whether it was true or not, I don't know. But in any event, I went to see this Methodist minister, and I'd also read a couple articles in some of the police bulletins about some of the big city police departments using regressive hypnosis on possible witnesses to get them to vividly recall and totally recall events that took place that they could use in a case. So I talked to this Dr. Wentz, went to see him, and I asked him if he was familiar with this practice, and he said yes, he was. A lot of people had come to him that had lost a wedding ring or had lost something that they couldn't find, and he could get them to totally recall that time frame, and in 90% of the cases he just used that as an example, but he said, yes, I can do it. So I told him what I was interested in. And I said, I've got an individual, if you'll agree to it. I said, I need to remember times, places, and events concerning some poaching activity, so I can go intelligently interview the two gentlemen that he's named as being a part of it. He said, well, yes, I think we can do that. He said, if you can get him to agree to it. So I called this Michigan farm implement dealer, and I put it to him as a challenge. And I said, I don't think you'd probably be up to anything like this, or have guts enough to do it. Well, that's all it took. He said, yeah, I'll do it. I'll be down. So this Dr. Wentz administered this regressive hypnotic examination of this witness. And I'll never forget, he put him under hypnosis and then turned him over to me for questioning. And I asked Mel Weiss to participate in this, and he said, no, Betty, that's spooky stuff. He said, you can handle that. He said, I said, I can tell you right now, it's probably a first for a game warden. But anyway, I proceeded to question this gentleman while he was in this hypnotic state, and I won't go into the procedures that Dr. Wentz used, but it didn't take him any time at all to put him under. And the second he was turned over to me by the examiner for questioning, I asked the first question. The gentleman had dropped his head down on his chest and started emitting the most guttural, animal-like growls I've ever heard in my life. And I thought, I'm out of here. And immediately the examiner stepped in and stopped that and told him to stop it. But he said a very weird thing. He said, we're not talking to you. To this day, I don't know who that hypnotist was talking to. But he said, you'll stop that and you'll answer this officer's questions. Well, frankly, I was so shook. But I managed to get through it, and we taped it. And he gave detailed, he told from the minute he picked him up at home about crossing the line into a high, about shining deer, how cold it was. And he would physically get cold. His lips would turn blue. And how they got up in the back of the truck and shot and missed them. But anyway, I got detailed information about both those hunts with both those individuals. And I went and picked up the first one and questioned him, and I'm rattling these times and places and facts off to him, and he went down. He signed the statement, came to a high voluntarily, and posted and forfeited bond. I went to number 2 and got nowhere with him. And I don't know where this question come from. I said, well, if you're innocent of all this, I said, you won't mind taking a polygraph? No, he said, I'll take it. Well, this was another first. And I done committed myself then. I called my supervisor the first time on paying Dr. Wentz for the regressive hypnosis. And he said, I guess you'll go to any length to make a case. And then when I called him the second time to get payment for the polygraph examination, he said, now I know you'll go to any length to make a case. Well, I picked this gentleman up in Reading, Michigan on the day of the examination. I transported him to the Patent Detective Agency in Toledo, Ohio. And Dick Patton was the examiner. And he took him in and put him on the machine. And I watched the proceedings through a one-way glass. And shortly, Mr. Patton come out and he says, your suspect is beating the exam. He's guilty, don't get me wrong, but he's beating the machine. I said, what? I didn't think that could be done. He said, yes, it can be done. He said, he's high on drugs. He said, he's taking something, I don't know what, but you're just wasting your time going any further with him. So I said, well, I assume that I'll get an official report from you on this. And he said, yes, you can have it right now. And I said, no, I want you to mail it to me. I don't want to take it with me. So he agreed to do that, and I paid him. And I got my suspect, my Michigan resident, back in the car, and we proceeded back to Reading. The boy never spoke a word to me coming or going. And we pulled up at his house, and he started to get out of the car, and I said, oh, wait a minute. I've got to give you a citation to appear in court. I had nothing. And he said, what? I said, well, I don't think you did too well on that machine back there. I said, time will tell, but in any event, I'm going to cite you into court. Be darned if he didn't come down posting forward a $150 bond, and that closed the case. But anyway, shortly after that, I'm not going to get into political issues, but there's some things happening in Ohio. I was called to Columbus and interviewed for the district law enforcement supervisor's job in 4, which was down in Athens, Ohio. Another agent was called in with me, and he was interviewed for the job, same position in Findlay, the district we both worked in. And my chief had my whole personnel file out there in front of him, and all my arrest records. I'd stayed in the top 5 in arrests as a wildlife enforcement agent, and just more or less said, you know, you're going. And I started to leave, and leave his door, and he said, Ron, wait a minute. He said, I've got to tell you something else. And I didn't really even get turned around. He said, you have to go back to your home county, or the county you work in now, and get an endorsement from the county Republican chairman. 14 years of service, perfect work record, and I got to go get an endorsement from the county Republican chairman. So the other agent had been told the same thing, and I know en route back to Findlay, his name was Gil Palmer. I said, what are you going to do? And Gil says, I got too much time, and he says, I'll go try to get the endorsement. I don't know if I can or not. He was from Ottawa County. And he said, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to resign. And he said, no, not going to happen. And I said, yeah, I'm going. Of course, what he didn't know was that I had got on the mid-level register for the federal government. And I said, I didn't say much more. I said, if that comes through, I'm going. So I got back to Montpelier, Ohio, and talked to Shirley. Shirley was county court clerk and knew all the politicians in the county. And I guess she could have got me the endorsement. But I asked who the county Republican chairman was. She told me he was a realtor downtown. So I went down to see him, and I never asked for the endorsement. I wound up telling him what I thought of the whole practice and that contaminated state service. It had no place in professional wildlife management. And I just told him what I thought. Well, the true political hack he was nice up until that point. And he said, well, I've never heard tell you doing anything for the Republican Party either here or anywhere else in the state of Ohio. And I excused myself and left. And I was so mad I was hyperventilating. It was bad. In just a few weeks, I was called to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and offered a park ranger's job in Indiana. They had taken my name off the Civil Service Register. And they offered me a job at $3,000 more a year than I was making, and I took it. I went back to see that county Republican chairman. And I won't repeat what I had to say to him, but it made him so mad that he followed me out on the street, which was exactly where I wanted him. And I headed for him. And he ran back in his office, and I looked across the street and saw a police cruiser pull up, and I knew that his secretary had called him. And I cooled off and went home. But anyway, that heralded my entry into the federal service. I went with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers as a park ranger, and I want to say here and now that that organization was one of the greatest organizations I was ever exposed to as far as professionalism. And I want to say this to the young people today that are trying to pursue careers in wildlife management. Take a good look at the Army Corps of Engineers. They may well, I don't have the stats on this, but they control thousands of acres of public lands and water. They've got a resource management program that is second to none. And in that day and time when that resource management program was just starting, they were starting park rangers out 2 grades higher than the National Park Service. And they're a great outfit, and you can do it all right there if you're interested in wildlife management work. But in any event, I started in as a park ranger, and I went to a project manager's job in eastern Kentucky, and from there to Portland, Oregon. When did we go to Oregon, Shirley, Judy?
About 1974.
I went to Portland, Oregon as an area park manager. And I got out there, and out there I worked in Oregon. The Oregon State Police enforced all state wildlife laws. It was all under one agency. They had a fishing game division under the Oregon State Police, and I worked very closely with two state troopers out there that were assigned to wildlife law enforcement. And it was there that I first heard of the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. And one of these officers had been to a meeting or had a paper of some kind that addressed and spoke to North Carolina's aircraft law enforcement program, and alluded to the fact that they seemed to be about the only state that had made an overwhelming success of this program. And I believe I was sitting beside the man that started it.
Yeah.
But in any event, this trooper, who incidentally was trying to go into federal service too, told me about this. And that was the first time I'd heard of the North Carolina Wildlife Commission to any degree, other than the fact that my chief in the Division of Wildlife, when I was assigned to Union County, name was Hayden Olds, and he had started his career as a young biologist with the North Carolina Wildlife Commission, and I think rose to the rank of assistant director.
Assistant director. He's the man that hired me.
Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Well, anyway, he assigned me to Union County in Ohio. Hayden left North Carolina and I think went to Tennessee as chief.
That's correct.
And then back to Ohio as chief, and then he went with the Federal Bureau of Outdoor Recreation, an agency that was ultimately abolished. But in any event, during my time out there, I heard about North Carolina. And I also heard that the National Marine Fisheries Service was recruiting special agents. And I thought that I had to get back into full-time wildlife enforcement as opposed to part-time wildlife management work and parks and recreation work. So to make a long story short, I applied with Marine Fisheries and was selected as a special agent with Marine Fisheries. And I was transferred from Sweet Home, Oregon to Cape Cod, Massachusetts. You couldn't go any further east. I'll never forget, we got to the Cape on July the 4th, and the weather was hot, the traffic was bumper to bumper. We had left a wilderness area to come to this. And she looked over at me and she said, "What have you done now?" But my office was at Provincetown in the federal building up over the post office. And I was only with Marine Fisheries about a year. But during that time, I forgot this. This was an award I got with Ohio in 1962 with Wildlife Officer of the Year. This was a award that I don't know if it's still given or not, but that was a joint session of the League of Ohio Sport and the Ohio Isaac Walton League. They called it the Ohio Conservation Congress, and I know they met once a year. And then with Marine Fisheries, I was only there a year, but I spent a good deal of time in the North Atlantic on treaty enforcement, known as the International Convention of North Atlantic Fisheries. There were 16 member nations that fished on Georgia's bank, and we enforced the provisions of the treaty, as well as provisions of the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And I happened to stumble into a Corps of Engineer installation on the Cape Cod Canal one day, and I heard a radio operating. And I heard all this foreign radio traffic that was coming in from the North Atlantic, and got to talking to the operator in there who didn't understand any of it. And I said, "Well, who is this talking out here?" And he said, "Well, it's the foreign fishing fleets." And he said, well, have you ever had anybody in here that could interpret and understand them or know what they're saying? And he said, well, there was at one time, and he said, I forget what agency they were with. He said it might have been the CIA or something, but he said they haven't been back since. And I said, well, are you sure that most of this radio traffic is the fishing fleet? He said, yeah, it's the Russians, the Cubans, the Romanians, the East Germans, the West Germans, they're all out there. And so I talked to him a little bit more, and I wrote up a program or a suggestion that the Marine Fisheries, National Marine Fisheries Service get some interpreters in there and listen to that traffic, and that we could gain some intelligence that we desperately needed as to the various fleets and where they were at in the North Atlantic, and it would help a lot in our enforcement program. And they followed that suggestion, and that was my award. As I say, though, I was only with them a year, maybe a little over a year, and I heard that a special agent's position was opening with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Pennsylvania, and I applied for it, and I got it. And then we came over from Marine Fisheries to the Fish and Wildlife Service. And how long we were in Pennsylvania, Mom?
2.5 years.
2.5. Mm-hmm. So there I met first of all, I want to say that I was fortunate to work with a very good state fish and game agency. And of course I was commissioned as a deputy game protector in Pennsylvania. My boss, the senior resident agent for the Fish and Wildlife Service in that state, was Mr. Leo Badger. And Leo was a former Pennsylvania wildlife officer and one of the greatest men I ever worked for. But I learned a lot under Leo. I spent a lot of time in the Chesapeake, and that was my first exposure to real heavy waterfowl hunting and all the attendant problems, the baiting, the overbagging. And working the Chesapeake is something every federal agent, every game warden should be exposed to. It almost compares with the coast of North Carolina. But in any event, I spent some very valuable time and learning experiences there. I made one of the very first Airborne Hunting Act cases that was ever made in the East in that state. And this involved some individuals that were shooting deer out of helicopters. But between Pennsylvania and the Chesapeake, I had some very, very active time there. And one day I was in the Harrisburg office, and Leo said, Ron, I'd been sent to North Carolina on one occasion to work duck hunters down in Currituck County. And I was very impressed with what I saw, both with the state officers, and of course I remembered what I'd learned and heard about in the state of Oregon, talked to some other agents that had worked in North Carolina. And I just made the statement in the Cambridge office one day that I'd like to have that state. If the senior resident agent's position ever came open down there. And I'll never forget, I was talking to Larry Thurman, and Larry said, you and about 25 other agents. He said, a lot of agents would like to go to North Carolina, including a couple gentlemen that were ex-North Carolina wildlife officers. Bobby Wright, I'm sure you remember Bobby. Bobby was stationed in Arizona as a federal agent, and the word was that if that job in Raleigh ever came open, that Bobby pretty well had showed up. And he did. Well, shortly I got word that North Carolina was in fact coming open, and I put in for it with very little hope of getting it. I found out in just a few weeks that Bobby had backed out and was not going to take it. And next thing I knew, my boss in Harrisburg called me and he said, "You're going to Raleigh." And I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah, you've got the job." He said, "We don't pre-select, but you've got the job." Willie J. Parker was my agent in charge at that time in Nashville, Tennessee.
I knew Willie.
Tennessee came under that District 10.
Ron, let me break in for a minute.
Right.
Let's take a little break out.
Okay.
We want to hear a lot more about
All right.
what you're just coming to here. But I think
we maybe need to load some more film.
Okay, Ron, so you're ready to come to work in North Carolina now, and I'm anxious to hear a lot more about that.
Okay, we ended a 2.5-year sojourn in Pennsylvania. Came to North Carolina in 1978. Had managed to land a senior resident agent's job there. And I should say that my subordinates, Agent Tom Bennett, and Ted Curtis, and Jerry Summers, at that time had preceded me in North Carolina by about a year. They had worked the waterfowl season on the coast the year before I got there. I guess about the second or third person I ever met was Bob Hazel here, and I went over to his office, and my boys had already told me about Bob. It seems when the three of them had got there, and I don't know the history about the agents that preceded them, but the bottom line was we didn't have a boat that would run. Our vehicles were in deplorable condition and worn out. We had 2 aircraft, and I believe one of them would fly and one of them wouldn't. And I had 3 young agents in there. Tom was the next California warden, and Ted was the next Kentucky wildlife officer and a pilot. And Jerry was from Illinois and the ex-IRS officer, federal agent. But there they were. They didn't know the geography or anything else. And Tom said, we went to see Mr. Hazel, and said he picked up the phone and called his captains all up and down the coast, and he says, instructed his captains to get these new federal agents in a boat, and he said his words was, get them where they need to be. Well, those 3 boys, 3 young agents, and the officers of the North Carolina Wildlife Commission, to Bob's everlasting credit, had the best year they ever had. They'd probably been better off if I'd never arrived, but they did a ton of catching, and they had Currituck tore up, they had Carteret County tore up, the phones were ringing, and the congressmen were being called. And, when Bob told those state officers to get those federal agents where they needed to be, they took him literally. But in any event, I arrived and found that I had 3 darn good agents. And I also pretty well knew that I had an awful good state agency to work with. And how long were you there as director till? I hadn't been there very long.
Well, I retired in February 1980.
Okay, you were there about 2 years.
Yeah.
But I remember I had flown out to El Paso and had to appear out there in court, and landed at Raleigh-Durham Airport and picked up the newspaper, and there it was on the front page that Bob Hazel was retiring and leaving the commission. And I thought, oh Lord, I've just got here. I've got a man I can work with and know I can. And I recall I went over to see Bob, and I guess it was pretty well cut and dried that you were leaving. And but in any event, a gentleman by the name of Vernon Bevel took Bob's place.
Right.
And fortunately, I was able to establish a very good working relationship with Director Bevel. And Vernon hadn't been there too long at all when he came to the office one day, and he said, I've got a wildlife commissioner up here at, what is it, Carla, Henderson or Hendersonville? Henderson. That has that district up there, and he said he's got a lot of grave concerns and getting a lot of bad reports about a lot of striper, illegal fishing operations going on up there. Well, to give just a brief background, the striper stocks on the Atlantic coast were in dire trouble. The stocks were depleted from overfishing and pollution and various other reasons, and the market had turned its forces inward into the inland lakes to try to fill this striper supply. And of course, the striper on the inland lakes was classified as a game fish and was unlawful to sell them. And the commissioner that came to Vernon stated that they are literally raping Carr Lake They're doing the same, not quite as bad on Gaston and on up into Roanoke Rapids Lake. And he said, you're going to have to do something about it. He said, I've got people up there that have come to me and said if the Wildlife Commission doesn't do something about it, they're going to take the law in their own hands and do it themselves. But they're not going to sit by and watch this go on. So Vernon came to me and he said, this, to me, is going to require an undercover operation. And he said, these fish are going out of state. We've got, North Carolina had a lot of good intelligence on who was doing what up there and where the market was and where the fish, a lot of good raw intelligence that any undercover operation has got to have before it ever gets started. And he shared that intelligence with me and reports that had come in from state wildlife officers and the public and so on and so forth. And it looked pretty good to me, and it looked like it needed done. And that coupled with the fact that when I called Atlanta, I found out for the first time that Jim Pulliam, was my regional director, was from Henderson. Mm-hmm. And Jim's family had heard these reports. And Jim was very concerned about it. And at that time we had to write these cases up for approval. And at the Washington office and the regional office. Well, the case was approved for undercover, as an undercover operation. And we started to work on that case in 1980. And it lasted for 2 years. It ran to 1982. It was called I'm Sorry, I'm Wrong. We started that case in 1983, and it ran until 1985 for 2 years. We managed to infiltrate that entire network of violators up there. That Lord included city police officers and just members of the public you would never suspect. First of all, we were staggered by the fact that I believe I bought the first load of rockfish. You had to stay within the market price, but I believe I bought the first load of rockfish at $2.65 a pound in the round that were illegally taken. We set up a bogus fisheries business in Sanson, Virginia, and which amounted to nothing more than a rented room with an answering phone in it, answering machine and a phone. And we started going to Carr Lake. All of my agents worked the case undercover. Ted and Jerry, by and large, went to Roanoke Rapids Lake, and Tom Bennett and I went to Carr and Gaston. And gradually we were posing as buyers. We were gradually able to infiltrate that system of individuals that were taking these stripers. We found that the peak month for taking the illegal stripers was, of all things, March. And these gentlemen would go out and fish the brushy points of the lake from the bank. At that time of the year, the stripers are not schooled. They're traveling in more or less individually around the shoreline. And they would use these herring shad that they would catch there on Nutbush Creek. They would fish all day and all night. And basically the method of operation was they would have a pit behind them somewhere on the bank with ice in it, usually dug in the ground and covered up with a hard cover over it with leaves and camouflage. They would catch their fish and put them in this pit that had ice in it. And then the buyers would come along and pick up the fish and then weigh them out and send the poacher a check through the mail. So it was very clever. There was no contact. There was no way that uniformed officers could surveil anything like this. And because the two didn't meet except through the mail. And there was one major buyer there. There was actually three, but one that, we were ultimately able to prove that he cleared $150,000 in 1 year on illegal stripers. And of course, he was into drugs and various other things. But in any event, we worked that case for 2 years, and we made 29 arrests when we took it down. And when was the raid date there? Oh yeah, January 18th, 1985 was raid date. We raided and arrested them all, and through that case, a total of $115,000 was taken in under the Lacey Act. And the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission received $88,000 in restitution under the Act. And at that time, it was the largest restitution penalty under the Act that had ever been paid in any state. And just prior to that, in 1980 and 82, Vernon came to us about some problems they were having in the fur industry in North Carolina. Basically, that case was turned into an undercover operation. Was predicated on the fact that bobcat and otter, which by both federal law and state law were required to be tagged before exported. This wasn't being done, but when we got into the case, we found all other kind of violations. It was simply, to make it short, a probe into the illegal fur industry in North Carolina. That case took us into the big fur markets of New York, and we arrested 72 individuals. That case operated from 1980 to 82. We took in $150,000 in fines under those Lacey Act and the Endangered Species Act, and pretty well put the lid on the illegal fur industry in North Carolina. Following that, South Carolina. In the meantime, I picked up South Carolina as agent in charge. I think I was in North Carolina about 3 years when we reorganized, one of the many that I went through. And I picked up South Carolina and two other darn good agents by the name of George Hines and Garland Swain. And George was stationed at Columbia, and Garland was stationed over on the coast. George's daddy, Tommy Hines, had been a federal agent and had been assigned to North Carolina. I think he was a former North Carolina wildlife officer. But anyway, George had grown up with the profession. And I very quickly learned that South Carolina was in the process of forming their state undercover unit, which in my opinion ultimately became the best in the nation. They were a crack outfit. They were trained. They had the equipment, and it was just a short time. I and George was approached by Dr. Timmerman, the director down there, and Bill Chastain, the chief of law enforcement, to do a major undercover operation that encompassed the whole state and encompassed everything. Problems that they had 30 years of intelligence on at Santee Cooper and Lake Hartwell and all throughout the state, everything from alligators to hybrid strappers to deer. We labeled that one Operation Wild, and we began it in 1985, and we ended in 1986. It went for 1 year. And by and large, I worked as an operative on that case, and Agent Hines, my South Carolina agents, did. By and large, the bulk of that case was carried to that South Carolina undercover unit. And Mr. J.C. Sims was the chief of it, and Larry McLean was one of his chief operators, and two others whose name I'm sorry to say I don't recall, but these guys were as good as I ever worked with at infiltrating a situation, and they were good after the fact investigators, and but we wound up arresting 70 when that was taken down, and we took in $180,000 in fines under the Lacey Act, and the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and the Endangered Species Act. Now that was just on the federal violations. I don't have a tally on the state fines that were taken in on that case, but I never forget on raid day, which was May the 6th, 1986, some of our cases the Fish and Wildlife Service conducted got some awful bad publicity, undercover cases I'm talking about, in the western states. We never had that problem because our U.S. attorneys and our state wildlife agencies that were involved would call a press conference on the day of that raid and would play it up front with the press and the public from that raid day forward. And we were there to explain what we had done and why we had done it. No, North Carolina did a beautiful. Bevel was good at that. Sam Curran was the U.S. attorney. And we just didn't get the adverse publicity that was being experienced elsewhere in the nation. And I think mainly it was because we were up front on raid day and explained to the public what was going down and why it went down. As a matter of fact, we got nothing but support. But in any event, I'll never forget the press conference that was called in Columbia. ABC News and CBS and NBC was there. And Bill Chastain, the chief of law enforcement, got up and gave a wonderful briefing to the press on what that operation was all about and what brought it about. And we got nothing but good publicity on that. Following that, I and a state wildlife officer by the name of Lamar Worley, it was only two operatives, during 1985 and 86, lasted for 2 years. We did a little case called Operation Mountain Man over in the mountains, western North Carolina. It was largely Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And these were taxidermists that were taking illegal and protected birds, everything from bald eagles to all the various raptors and birds of prey, in and mounting them for people and in some cases selling them. And Lamar and I worked that case. I had a lot of hilarious moments with Worley. I'll have to tell one more story real quick. Lamar had a habit of trying to break me up when we were working a target. And he was the big old mountain boy, as good a game warden as I ever worked with.
Yeah, no,
Very slow in talking, but we'd gone into Lenore, North Carolina, was working this taxidermist who was mounting selling raptors. He had taken us down into his basement, and he had a ferret down there in the cage. And I know in the state of Ohio it was illegal to even possess one, that they would use them to hunt with. And they're in the mink family, but it's an animal that if very temperamental, and if you move very quickly, they'll grab a hold of about anything that's near them. And Lamar went over and just mused and made all manner of praise over that cute little critter, and asked the gentleman to get it out of the cage and show it to him. And as the gentleman did this, Lamar was standing behind him and went like that with his hand, and that ferret come out of the cage all right on the guy's finger. So anyway, we got the ferret off the guy's finger and put it away. And as I say, he liked to play games, so he started telling the taxidermist about this cute little owl that stayed in his front yard. He said, just a little bitty fellow, said about like this, and said he would fly ever so softly every evening through the trees, and said you could hardly hear the little fellow fly. And said my daughters just thought the world and all of him. He even gave him a pet name, and he said, you know, my girls like that owl so much, he said, I just up and shot him. And he said, I took him and never cracked a smile. I'm dying. I'm saying, world, I'll kill you. When we get down the road, and he's looking at me, he's trying to break me up. But he tells this horrible story about killing this owl, and he said, you know, my daughters, I had him stuff to put on their bedroom wall. And he says, I thought they'd appreciate that. But she says, you know, they just cried their little eyes out. And this taxidermist, I'll never forget, looked at Worley and he said, you man, you are sick. But anyway, I had to put up with this all during this operation, working with Lamar Worley, the North Carolina Wildlife Commission.
that was him.
Following that, one more quick one. We're working up there on deer patrol at night with Ben Wade and all the boys in District 9, and Lamar had come on the radio and was evidently apprehended 2 shiners, and was having a little bit of a problem with him. We were trying to get to him, and we never made it. But when we got there, needless to say, one of the violators had been manhandled. And I'll never forget, I forget who I was with, I think it was Ben Wade, but he said something to Lamar about, why didn't you try to give us better directions so we could have got you here a little quicker? help you with this situation. Lamar made a very famous statement. He says, all tweren't nothing. He said, these are good old boys. He said, just had to smack them around a little bit. But anyway, that was Lamar. What a game ward. Following that, in 1985 to 88, which was 3 years, we did Operation Smoky, and I was the case agent on that case, and that was a probe into the illegal killing and trafficking in American parts in the Smoky Mountain National Park and the Smoky Mountains. And that case was, of course, made into a film that was aired nationally on television about 5 times, and probably the most dangerous case I ever worked. But there again, I was blessed with good agents and good operatives. My guys could do anything. They could do run and catch work. They could do after the fact investigating. They could do undercover work. They could do it all. And we did Smoky in cooperation with Tennessee State Wildlife Agency and the North Carolina Wildlife Agency, and to some extent the South Carolina Agency. But there were some real bad individuals in this. We set up a bogus import-export business in Nashville, Tennessee, and during the course of that thing, more or less the leader of this one faction of poachers, who was also a professional drug dealer and a professional arsonist, also a professional hitman. He could take a man out for you for $10,000. I had him on tape making that offer, but he got suspicious of us. And he announced to our agent in Tennessee, who was posing as my nephew and running our business over there, that he wanted to come to Nashville for a visit. And of course we knew what he wanted to do was check everything out. Fortunately, we had the offices and the secretaries. We had a cooperating import business over there that the owner of which had gone through college with our special agent over there. So we wasn't worried, but in any event, we decided to go ahead and entertain this gentleman and his girlfriend over in Tennessee. And the agent over there, his name was David Cartwright, an absolutely outstanding undercover operative. And David, in his younger days, had been a guitarist with Mel Tillis. And as Tillis grew in fame and everything, Dave realized he wasn't quite good enough to stick with him, went on to college and become a game warden with the state of Tennessee and ultimately a federal agent. But Dave knew his way around Opryland, and this gentleman in North Carolina that wanted to check us out made one mistake. He gave us 14 days to think. So I told Dave, I said, it's all your ball game over there. You're going to have to figure out. We had to come up with a $500,000 home at least. But Dave had Opryland at his disposal. He knew his way around all Opryland security and all the hierarchy over there, and had worked with a lot of the entertainers that performed there. And 2 days later, Dave called me and he said, I've got it all set up. We're going to entertain the violator and his girlfriend at Opryland for a weekend. And he said, we're going to show them the whole town. He said, then we're going to stage a marital split up between me and my wife, who is a special agent out of Miami. Agent Maureen Matthews was flown up there to pose as his wife. Shirley June Bailey posed as my mistress from Richmond, and we got us a big Lincoln and we went to Nashville. Well, we got, never forget, we had the suite at the Opryland right next to the presidential suite. We had, 3 bedrooms, 3 baths, a grand piano, and just an immaculate setup. It's all a sting. We had to promise this guy was a notorious car and truck thief. And we had to promise Opryland security that we would not let him steal a car or two out of the parking lot over there, which was the first thing he wanted to do when he got there. But in any event, we arranged to entertain this couple for the total purpose of reestablishing confidence with him. I don't know where he'd got this information, but he had heard that we were undercover agents. But of course, we got over there 3 days early, and Maureen flew in from Miami, and Mom and I arrived. We had her dressed like Joan Crawford. We had her looking at jewelry all over. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation was interested in this same suspect for stealing vehicles in Tennessee. So they had a vital interest in him. And the gig was that we would go to Opryland and we would visit the entertainment. I'll never forget, we saw Emmylou Harris and who else? Porter Wagner. We went to the show. And we hired a big white limousine to pick us up there at the Opryland to go down to the show after our two outlaws arrived. And of course, we went down to the show and to see the performance as it was being taped. They were taping a TV program. And I remember they had the audience move around so the camera would look like the theater was full for this. But in any event, the Tennessee agent's wife, they had to stage this marital split up, and the whole gig was they were going to have a marital split up so we wouldn't have to take them to a $500,000 home and entertain them with a steak dinner we didn't have. So Maureen's popping saccharin tablets, I know, all during this show and supposedly getting higher. And they start bickering while these shows are being performed at Opryland. And the crescendo builds and the bickering gets louder and louder, and I finally have to take them up into the reception area there and try to give them a little marriage counseling. And of course, my cover was that I was his uncle. And the bad guy comes up with us, and he's listening to all this. And I'm saying, you guys have got your kids to think about and all this. And he said, my undercover officer said, well, Uncle Buck, she's getting higher by the minute. He said, I don't know if I can keep her under control or not. So we go back down and resume watching the shows. And Maureen continues to pop these saccharin tablets and get higher and crazier. Finally, the shows get over with, and we get in our limousine and we go to the Jack Daniels Lounge at Opryland. Now, this is all staged. Tennessee Bureau of Investigation is filming all this from a balcony behind the proverbial potted plant. And we go down into the lounge and we have this dinner. And I'll never forget, there was a young lady up there in a long white gown playing a harp on a pedestal. And now it's time for the undercover agent's mistress or girlfriend to arrive on the scene. This will finish the marital breakup. And we're all having drinks and had ordered our dinner down there. And this beautiful little Tennessee Bureau of Investigation agent comes down the spiral staircase and, hi Dave, it's me. And Cartwright was such a good actor that his face actually turned red. He could embarrass. He should have been on the screen. Here's his wife sitting beside him, Maureen Matthews, and here's his girlfriend arriving. And the little girlfriend pulls up, and Cartwright feebly sits her down beside him and starts introducing her around the table. This is so-and-so, bear hunting buddy of mine from North Carolina, and his girlfriend, and this is my Uncle Buck, and this is his lady friend from Richmond. And he gets around to Maureen, and she sticks her head out around him, and I won't repeat what she says, but she says, yeah, I'm his wife. Whereupon the little Tennessee Bureau of Investigation agent, alias the mistress, blows up, calls him all kinds of names, and leaves the scene. Well, then Maureen, she blows up his wife, and before she leaves, she throws her drink right in his mid area. And she exits Opryland with Dave running after her. And but her parting lines were, I don't want to see these people at my house. You get rid of them. I'm not entertaining nobody. And we're off the hook on the $500,000 home. But we still got them lodged there at Opryland. So they do have a nice bed to sleep in. And in any event, Cartwright looks at me and her and says, go find her. Says she's popping speedballs. And says, it's hard to tell what will happen. You got to find her. So we're done. We're done for the evening. We leave and go across town to an apartment that's owned by Cartwright's parents. And of course, Maureen Matthews is already there waiting on us. The wife had left the scene. So Dave come back over there to us about 3 o'clock in the morning, and this agent was strung out. He had taken this couple up to their rooms to put them to bed, and he just broke down, crying that his marriage had ended, and he'd even lost his girlfriend, and that he was just he could cry at will. But the lady friend of the bad guy eases up beside him on the couch and puts her arm around him and says, "You know, this happens to a lot of families. You got to get a hold of yourself, but you are a very nasty man." So that ended the gig at Opryland. But that was my swan song, and the last case that I worked just for retirement. We made scrapbooks of all of our undercover operations in the Carolinas as they were being done, and if Bob would go through these, he would see a lot of pictures he would recognize, some of his boys and what they ultimately came to. But we used some awful good North Carolina operatives in that case, and as I say, we took it down, and 43 arrests in 1988, Lacey Act, Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and we took in $152,000 in fines. But all told, for a decade, the North Carolina and South Carolina agents and the state wildlife officers in those states led the nation in undercover operations. I'm very proud of that.
Should be.
As field agents, I should say as field agents, we led the nation. And nobody, I don't think, even came close to us. But the Special Ops Division, the full-time undercover boys out of Washington, of course, were doing big business all during this time. But I don't know, I think we beat them. But in any event, that pretty well ended my career. And I just want to say, I've always had a saying, I never worked a day in my life. It was never work. And I'd sure do it all again. That's about it.
Ron, that's a terrific story. I want to thank you. You could go on, and I know enough firsthand about this law enforcement stuff. These undercover stories are fascinating, and most people never hear about them. And I'm glad you told us about what you did. And you've had an outstanding career, and one that I think will be an inspiration to the fellows that are coming on to follow.
Well, I hope so.
And that's one of the reasons we're doing these interviews. We encourage students to look at them. They need to know something about the history of what's gone before. And a lot of times they can hardly believe the things they hear. But
Yeah,
they're real. True. And so this has been a real good interview. I want to thank you for it and for all the work you've done. One thing I do want to mention is the date. Today is October 22, 2004. And this interview, along with the others that we've done, will be on file at the Library of Natural Resources at NC State University and with the national headquarters of the Wildlife Society. So thanks again.
Well, thanks for giving me the honor of telling you my story.
Right.